Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. My name is Muhammad Numan. How are you, my dear students? I hope you will be fine. Welcome to Advanced English Grammar. In our today video, we are going to talk about here the uses of ought to, where we can use ought to correctly. We use ought to whenever we are making the recommendation. Whenever we are suggesting to someone, in that case, we use the modal verb ought to. Or whenever we are advising to someone, in that case, we can also use ought to. And one thing we have to keep in our mind, ought to is similar to should in the meaning, but it is a little stronger than should and not as strong as must. Okay, you have to keep these words in your mind. Now let's talk about in the detail about the modal verb ought to. I have given 3 examples here. Through these examples, we can know where to use ought to correctly. And these 3 sentences can give us a complete sense about the using of ought to. Okay? So the first example, you ought to exercise more. You ought to exercise more. One thing we have to know, you ought to exercise more. The base form of the verb, the root form of the verb, or you can also say the first form of the verb will be used with the modal verb ought to. Not the second form, the third form, or the ing form will not be used, will not be written with the modal verbs. Okay? And now here we are talking about in the present. We are using ought to in the present. So in the present we use ought to plus base form of the verb. Now here, you ought to exercise more. I'm suggesting to my friend that you have to exercise. You should exercise more. I'm making the recommendation here. I'm advising to my friend that you should exercise more. Okay? So whenever we are suggesting to someone, advising to someone, we are using ought to. Okay, the second example here is that she ought to she ought to receive the package tonight. Whenever someone deserves something, we use in that case ought to. The third example, Ali ought to get the promotion. Whenever we are talking about the expectations, for the expectation, we also use ought to. When something is expected, for that purpose, we use ought to. Now here, look at here, Ali ought to get the promotion. So now here he deserves something. He expects something here. For the expectation, we use ought to. Now here, ought to in the past. How we can use ought to in the past? Let's see. We use ought to in the past whenever we are going, we did some action there, and for example, we did not do something, or we did something in the past, but now here in the present we are regretting. The regretting is here. For the regretting, whenever we are regretting something in the present, we use for that purpose ought to plus have third form of the verb. Now look at here the example, I ought to have studied biology, not physics. Here he studied the physics, but now here he is regretting that why did I study physics? Instead of that would have better to study biology instead of physics. So for the regression, we use here the ought to plus third form of the verb. I ought to have studied. Now look at here, third form of the verb we have used here. I have studied. I ought to have studied biology, not physics. So it is a kind of regression. For the regression we use ought to. Another example, you ought to have helped him, but you did not. You ought to have helped him, but you did not. So for whenever we are regretting something, we use ought to plus third form of the verb. Now here how we can use ought to in questions, but mostly it is not used in the questions. Okay, instead of ought to we use should, but this is also grammatically correct. There is no problem. You can use ought to in the questions. Now look at here, the first example, ought he call the police? Ought he call the police? To is omitted here. To will not be written. You cannot say ought he to call the police. You can say ought he call the police for making the questions. Ought we complete this now? So he is getting the opinion from someone, from his teacher, that ought we complete this now. So for the opinion, for the suggestion, we use ought in questions too. Ought we complete this now? And in the negative sentence, how we can use in the negative sentences ought to, you ought not smoke so much. So for the prohibition, when something is prohibited, for that purpose we also use ought to. You cannot say here, you ought not to smoke. No, not at all. You just say simply, you would say, you ought not smoke so much in the negative sentence. Okay, they ought not they ought not carry so much cash while traveling. So here we use ought to in the negative sentences for the prohibition when something is prohibited. So it was our today class about the modal verb ought to. And inshallah in the next video I will be talking about will and shall, where we can use will and shall correctly. So do subscribe our channel. The name of our channel is Spread the Useful Knowledge. Share these videos with your friends and with your relatives through WhatsApp, Messenger, and the Facebook. That would be very kind of you. Thanks a lot of you. Thanks about now.